the first bit.
Start it up here. And we'll share my screen. Can y'all see that?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. All right, this is called On Sanctions, and it just has my name on it, but Josh will come in later on. I forgot to put Josh's name on here, and I feel bad about that. But
Yeah.
First of all, this is going to read kind of like this is going to be kind of like a almost like a research project, but sanctions is a long topic in like international relations and foreign policy analysis where people ask what the benefit of sanctions are. Like sanctions, I have it here is first of all, here's the definition. It's a coercive foreign policy that utilizes economic means to produce a desired outcome. And it's different from war, of course, because we're not invading a country. It's different from some diplomatic condemnation where, the ambassador gets up and says, the United States government opposes this action. There's not really a lot of teeth to it. Sanctions is kind of what happens after we get done with the really kind of low risk stuff. And you got to understand these foreign policy decision making options are on a spectrum from like no risk at all, or positive statements, or opening embassies and things like that, or very positive low risk things, to very high risk things like all the way up to invasion and occupation of a country. And those are all different foreign policy options that foreign policy makers get to choose from. And sanctions is probably right. If you had that scale from 1 to 7, sanctions would be right, either a 2.5 or a 3, right in the middle of that list, but not really a lot of high risk, especially the way we do it now. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. So in this definition, that's coercive foreign policy that utilizes economic means to produce a desired outcome. Of course, coercive means the sanctions are designed to compel some sort of change in policy. They're always reactive. Like you don't just like wake up one day and decide to put sanctions on people. They're always designed in reaction to some policy that another government, i.e. the target of these sanctions, is doing that you don't like, and you want them to change that policy. So, for example, if the war in Ukraine is a pretty good example where Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States will put sanctions on oligarchs in Russia, uh, designed to get them to put pressure on the Putin government to get him to change the policy of invasion in Ukraine. That part doesn't necessarily ensure a specific outcome in the sanctions regime. It just ensures that you're aiming to try to use pressure to get them to change their policy. This all is, I should also mention, this all is based on this whole notion that each state is sovereign, meaning they have control over what they do within their own government. And so the norm of sovereignty, which goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia from the 17th century, it states that the United States can't tell Russia how it's supposed to govern its own country. We can express our dissatisfaction with the way Russia is doing its own thing by some sort of force. That's really the only option we have available to us. And in this case, economic sanctions are a kind of force that we're intending to apply toward Russia. It's a foreign policy, which means it's directed at another government, but they're often done in response to domestic demands. So we have domestic actors in this country, or people who are coming over this country from Ukraine, for example, and lobbying the U.S. government, demanding that the United States address the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We don't have anything to do with Ukraine. Ukraine's a sovereign country. We don't have anything to do with Russia. Russia's a sovereign country. But we have decided that we are going to act on behalf of our friends in Ukraine by putting sanctions on Russia. That's the reasoning of the U.S. government and the understanding behind the sanctions regime. Again, it's directed at another government. So it's a foreign policy. There are two different actors, of course. One of them is a target, which is Russia in this case, and one of them is a sender, which is the United States. The United States is considered the sender of sanctions, and that's how the foreign policy thing works. It utilizes economic means in terms of available options within sanctions regimes. We see interruption of trade, which are called trade sanctions, some boycott or embargo. That's what we've been doing to Cuba for the last like 60 years plus. This is not necessarily a trade war, though. That's not considered sanctions, like where the United States will put a tariff on foreign steel because they don't want them competing with American steel producers. That's not the same thing as a sanction. Sanction is meant to change a specific policy that government is doing. So those type of situations where we're doing legitimate economic competition between countries is not considered sanctions. It's just considered, trade things. Or interruption of credit and international finance, which are called economic sanctions. So you have trade sanctions and economic sanctions. The economic sanctions are way more in vogue, especially after the Cold War, where the United States is considered the major or hegemonic economic player in the world finance markets. Lots of people utilize dollars. Lots of people try to get money from places like the IMF. And so if the U.S. is able to put pressure through those institutions, our lending institutions or our international financial institutions to get those countries to do what we want them to do. Those are considered economic sanctions. And like I said, those are way more in vogue in the post-Cold War era because we're really the only large player that people can go to, even still, even though we have some competition from, uh, people like the UAE or China or not even the EU, but just really those other ones. Still, the U.S. dollar is still hegemonic in the global financial system. And finally, they're frequently used when a country wants to punish another country for some policy but doesn't want to resort to war. Uh, there's not any other really. I mean, if you don't put economic sanctions on your friends, the United States is not going to economically sanction our large trading partners unless we are really specifically upset that Canada, for example, might be dumping lumber and destroying our lumber industry. Then we might put a tariff, but that's really not even a sanction. That might just be just part of a trade war. So it's frequently designed to punish another country for something where we want to get them to change, but we don't want to attack them or go to war. And it's important to mention that it's often a step toward war. You put, diplomatic pressure on, then you put economic sanctions on, then you put, military force down. When you finally have decided that you've had enough and you decide you want to overthrow the government. As I mentioned here, this is usually used as a middle ground, especially in liberal literature on the subject. This is considered a middle ground between diplomatic protests and military intervention. They're acceptable for liberal democracies because they want to show that a government takes some policies seriously and is acknowledging the norm of sovereignty, which is very important in both realist literature and liberal literature, but doesn't want to go to war, which the liberals, they have all these different things, these different tools are available to help them avoid the inevitability of war, which the realists see is always going to happen. This is a liberal considered by Pape from 1998 here considers it the liberal alternative to war. Economic sanctions are utilized by liberal governments like the United States because we don't like to go to war specifically, and there's a lot of domestic pressure against going to war in a democracy. But economic sanctions are on the table, and people will see that as an opportunity to get some kind of policy change without resorting to war. It's often the least bad of several options rather than the best options. It's never the best option. Like putting economic sanctions on someone is never a really good option. But when you have the choice of either attacking, or doing an embargo, and you think that the outcome is going to be the same one way or another, the costs for economic sanctions are significantly less. So for goals of the sanctions, now here's Huffbauer and Schott. Well, this is the main sanctions literature in economic foreign policy literature. Huffbauer and Schott, and there's also some later updates to this work. This is their article that kind of got it all started, and then they wrote a book that analyzed several policy changes or economic sanctions regime that resulted in sort of destabilization or policy change. I'm just going to go through these real quick. They have 5 goals for these economic sanctions: the modest policy goals, which is getting a target to change some specific set of policies, i.e., some anti-terrorism action or supporting a human rights policy. In this case, modest policy goals, be considered like, defending the Uyghurs or something like that. If the United States is really concerned about the Uyghurs in China, they might put sanctions on China because they're upset about how the Chinese government treats that group of people. Destabilization is a significantly more risky option or goal for sanctions here, and this is aimed to weaken the target government vis-a-vis its domestic oppositions. Destabilization is, just like the word says, it's always designed to knock the government off balance, and so it utilizes a lot of economic or trade sanctions, either to apply pressure to specific groups in the society to get them to overthrow the government. And at the same time, they're also used with weakening actions to deny the government the ability to deal with the crisis that their economic sanctions are created. And this is where I do most of my work in destabilization, or did most of my work in the destabilization literature. This is where I happen to have my expertise, is about how the governments and why governments will work to destabilize foreign regimes. And some examples of this would be cutting off international credit to deny them the ability to address economic crises that are happening in their country, often also as part of the destabilization campaign. Also tanking commodities markets to destroy the economy, like what Nixon did with the tin market in Bolivia in the early 1970s. Bolivia had tin mines and these sorts of things, and uh, they rely on high international commodity prices to get any kind of income for their country, because they almost like completely reliant on tin for export and acquiring hard currency. So the Nixon administration decided that they were going to drop all of our strategic reserve of tin onto the market all at once, to basically drop the price of tin down to almost nothing, which crushed the Bolivian economy and caused a huge economic crisis in Bolivia. And at the same time, they were cutting off credit to international lending agencies to Bolivia to deny them the ability to get any money to address any of those problems that try to help the people. So the whole goal was to overthrow the government of Bolivia. And finally, punishing nationalization will be part of destabilization as well. Disrupting of military adventures overseas. The aim is to eliminate support or resources for foreign military actions. In other words, the way we're doing with Russia invading Ukraine. This is an invasion, a response to some invasion, or supporting one side in a civil war is another example of that. So we put sanctions on Russia because we don't like that they invaded Ukraine. We deny Russians the ability to march under their own banner at the Olympics. All this stuff is all part of the sanctions against Russia. Another one is to impair the military capabilities. This is aimed at long-term weakening of foreign adversaries. In other words, if we have selective prevention of nuclear proliferation, to deny one side in a nuclear conflict the ability to acquire nuclear weapons to defend itself, or to kind of counter the threats that it's getting from the other side. We'll put sanctions on them. Also, arms embargoes and no-fly zones against defeated enemies. I think of Iraq after the Gulf War, where we had a no-fly zone. And at the same time, we were also promoting economic sanctions for destabilization purposes by denying them any arms or anything like that, and cutting off their oil exports to deny them the ability to acquire food for their people. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. And finally, the last one here is other major policy changes aimed at, of course, major policies. Measures against apartheid and efforts to release political prisoners or hostages can be eligible for economic sanctions. Importantly, the sanctions are often levied for the purpose of domestic audiences. Like, the people that make the policies about sanctions don't actually necessarily really believe that they're going to work, but we need to demonstrate, especially in democracies, that we're doing something. So we'll put sanctions on some country. We'll announce those sanctions like they're a real huge deal. A lot of times they don't really mean anything at all, and we'll talk a little bit more about the likelihood of success with those kind of sanctions. Here's 9 commandments. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are 9 commandments for sanctions. These are, if you want to have a more effective sanctions regime. These are things you need to pay attention to. And the big ones here are that they're most effective against weak and helpless countries. If a country has like a zillion trading partners, they don't they're not going to be concerned about your trade sanctions. They won't work if you impose trade sanctions on a country. And hold on a second. Can't talk right now. Okay, we'll have to wait for a minute. That's just a while. A while. Excuse me, I'm talking to my daughter right now. What? A while. Yeah, because I'm doing something right now. All right. Okay. Walking is not a bad thing. All right. So sanctions are most effective against weak and helpless countries. If you have a lot of contact and a lot of connections with other countries, you can easily get around whatever sanctions people put up against you. And they're most effective when they impose maximum pain on a target country. And Hufbauer and Schott determined that a greater than 2% GDP decline is considered maximum pain. If you can disrupt a country to the extent that you're wiping out 5% of their GDP, they're going to be in some serious issues. Because if you imagine like what 5% of GDP in the United States would look like, um, that'd be a serious hit to our economy. I mean, everybody would. I mean, we already have a lot of poverty. Now poverty would go through the floor at that point. Also, um, the more that they cost domestic actors, the more that these sanctions cost domestic actors, the more likely they're fail. In other words, domestic actors who are also sort of punished by the sanctions, like we deny this this country the ability to trade with these companies from the United States. Well, these companies do most of their business in that country, so they're going to put domestic pressure on, and they're also going to look for ways to skirt around those sanctions to prevent them from losing their business. And so, in a liberal economy, this is especially important. The more your sanctions indirectly hurt smaller or domestic firms, the more likely those sanctions are to fail. And international cooperation is usually only sought in high stakes sanctions that will likely fail anyway. If we're just doing the sanctions by ourselves, we're not seeking international cooperation on those sanctions. We have a greater chance actually of them succeeding because those sanctions regimes tend to be for lower stake or lower risk actions. So let's move on here. We're getting close, I guess. Dresner here is a realist response to the liberal literature from Hofbauer and Schott. Dresner 2015 talks about trade sanctions that hurt both trading partners, and he brought this in. He's like, okay, let's look at not only how trade sanctions hurt the targets, but also the senders, which is kind of like what we want to talk about here. It's not just the targets that are getting hurt. It's not the people in the targets that are getting hurt. It's also the senders that get hurt as well. Dresner talks about how Gulf War sanctions, for example, ended up costing Iraq about half its GDP. And when you think about what that means a humanitarian crisis in Iraq. Iraq is an oil rich country. It has an oil curse. In other words, it primarily exports oil, and that's how it gets its money. It uses that money to buy food for its people. If you don't have that kind of money, you can't buy food on the international market, and they don't grow a lot of food in Iraq, given the fact that it's mostly a desert. And so, uh, they really caused a lot of pain, not only for Iraq but also for the people of Iraq. And this was a humanitarian crisis. And now all of a sudden, the United States has a humanitarian crisis that they created with their sanctions regimes on their hands that they have to do something with. And that not only created this humanitarian crisis as well, it also created significant disruptions in our world energy markets. We saw gas prices go up here at home, which of course undermines the willingness of American voters to continue to support sanctions regimes at the polls. These targeted financial sanctions was therefore developed as an effort to mitigate the negative externalities of these trade sanctions. When you see negative externalities, what that means is like basically it's not just hitting the people you're aiming at; it's hitting everyone around them. So that's a negative externality. Where the effects of the sanctions are externalized; they go out to other populations. So we decided to start doing targeted financial sanctions as a response to the disasters that are caused by trade sanctions. However, these financial sanctions or these economic sanctions are less effective because of the nature of global finance. Global finance is globalized. If we can't get the kind of credit that we're looking for from American dominated banks, we could just go to European lenders and they'll give us money, or we could go to Chinese lenders and they'll be happy to give us money. Uh, and they also don't impose, because they don't impose a significant cost on the target's enemy, on the economy, they just imposed costs on specific economic actors within the country. They have a very limited effect. And also, if you like target, in this case, Saddam Hussein or whatever you want to say, Vladimir Putin or whatever, like he's not going to have the resources that he needs to buy off his political opposition. That's how dictatorships and authoritarian regimes stay in power for so long. They're able to turn a lot of individual resources into bribes that help them control the various components of their society that might otherwise oppose them. Well, if you put sanctions on, Putin or Saddam Hussein or whatever, and they're less able to do that, then they got to resort to more force. So actually, these targeted financial sanctions don't necessarily mitigate these negative externalities so much as they create more likelihood of repressing opposition, as elites are less able to reward their loyal supporters and need to turn to force to maintain their power. Their goal, of course, is to stay in power. No one can say that Putin or Saddam Hussein has the best interest of their people in mind when they're in power. They're usually a part of a ruling clique that are there to aggrandize and protect themselves. They usually are able to bribe their opponents to the point where the main actors in the opposition will side with the government as opposed to being against them. But if they lose that ability, then they start returning to repression, and you see the oppression of the people go up as a consequence. And this could also lead to U.S. foreign countries abandoning the U.S. dollar. This is a negative externality that these financial sanctions don't anticipate. For example, if I know that if I'm stuck on the US dollar and the United States can use that dollar as a weapon against me, I might start looking for other people to give me money. I might start going to the petrodollars or to the EU or something like that, which is a next negative externality in itself because it weakens the United States' ability to produce change through these sanctions in the long run. Do these sanctions work? Well, Hufbauer and Schott in 1985 admitted, while they were bragging about how effective these sanctions were, they admitted that they only contribute to about 36% success rate in the cases that they studied. Mostly in the areas of modest political goals and destabilization. The other ones that didn't necessarily have a lot of outcome, or the outcome was indeterminate as a result of the sanctions regime. Robert Pape went through there and said, well, we need to reevaluate the work of Hufbauer and Schott of these sanctions, because most of the ones that they call successes weren't really actually sanctions, or they weren't really as successful as the authors made them out to be. And so Pape adopts his realist position to say that sanctions are not more effective than military force. If you really want to change something, you're still down to force at the end of the day. However, that force is applied. It can be applied through military invasion, through destabilization, whatever you want to use. But really, those forceful options are at least as effective as the economic options that liberals support as being an alternative to war. And Dresner takes a kind of a different take on Pape's work. Kind of draws a lot from Pape and says that there are potentials for sanctions to create blowback, which is also something you need to be considered about. That's what we need to be concerned with: the ability to the expectation that sanctions will create blowback for us. So when our government sanctions another country, does it create more problems for us? And we could say yes, indeed, it does, because sanctioning Russia has more or less given Putin the excuse to take off the gloves and do whatever he was going to do anyway, and we don't have the ability to stop him at all. But now that gets us into a war where we're dropping $130 billion into Ukraine to prop that government up, as well as underwriting their entire military industrial complex. So that is one of the issues of blowback. Another issue of blowback on sanctions regimes is we see people like Osama bin Laden utilizing that as an excuse to go blow up a couple buildings in New York City. That's blowback. Osama bin Laden didn't just appear in a vacuum. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to attack the United States. That's a result of U.S. foreign policy in his region of the world. You can read his manifesto and it'll tell you all about it. It's simply blowback. Whether or not it is right is a moral discussion that I'm not really engaged in right now. But the fact is, historically speaking, the one thing led to the other, and the other is blowback. And so these sanctions regimes and different types of pressure campaigns like this from the United States tend to lead to blowback, especially in the modern era. So our conclusions here, I've got a few conclusions, and I really maybe we can save these until Josh goes. Josh, you want to?
What?
Are you ready to take over? Maybe we can save these conclusions here until you go, or I can present the conclusions to this one. It's up to
Yeah,
you.
I mean, if you want, I can go over the conclusions that you've made, and then I've got some comments and then a discussion.
Yeah, why don't you take it? Why don't you take that part?
What was that?
I'd say why don't you take this part if you want to do that? Is that what you
Okay.
wanted to do?
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
do. Okay, comrades.
Just tell me when you want to change the slide.
Okay. According to the conclusions are that most literature now concludes that sanctions, if they work, have very limited positive impact. Sanctions, depending on how they are defined, only work some of the time, and then only in very specific circumstances, and most often they only work when they can cause significant economic pain. And then the assumption that the leader cares, there's an assumption in it that the whatever leader that we are trying to remove from office actually gives a shit about the population. Targeted financial sanctions are far less effective than comprehensive trade-based sanctions. And the goal, therefore, is to create such a crisis in the center that the people demand a response from the government. And unaccountable regimes leaders can insulate themselves from that public pressure. And I was going to comment, but it's in the next section. Sanctions without significant economic damage are less effective at changing the policy, but still painful to the working class and the poor. Humanitarian crises like the famine in Iraq post-war and the civil war in Libya generally affects the poorest segments of the population hardest, and the famine itself can be the cause for additional sanctions. Most literature
Just
also,
real quick, just a word on that. We sanction a country for doing something we don't like, and it causes a famine. Well, then we'll sanction that country for not being able to protect its people, in the famine, and not working to mitigate the famine that our sanctions originally caused. I think that's what that was. It's kind of strange the way that sometimes those are thought about, but yeah.
yeah. Well, and basically well, I'll continue the slide and then get into discussion. Most literature discusses highly negative impact, and I noticed that myself in researching this about just about deaths associated with sanctions are pretty large numbers. Besides the pain and humanitarian suffering in the target, it also produces negative externalities, which Bill discussed earlier. Trade wars can damage the economy too, especially with under the globalization capitalist regime. Economic warfare can limit direct blowback onto the sending country, but other long-term disruptions could lead to radical changes in the global economic structure. And then Bill has a couple listed here. Gas and food bottlenecks as a result of EU sanctions against Russia give U.S. capitalists all the excuse they need to gouge American consumers, which we are seeing. Can also lead the sending country to no longer having any leverage over targeted actors, freeing them from any constraints of their actions, which basically means that, like, if I have no benefit to be better, then fuck it, let's bring it on. And then the conclusions, then why use them? And I would say that we should not, but we'll do that in the discussion. Sanctions.
We can actually skip most of this by summing it up and saying that, you know, we do sanctions for domestic political consumption. We don't really believe that they're actually going to work. We do it more for domestic political consumption, but it can backfire under these situations here where people know that the sanctions are just a joke and they're not going to work, and they impose more costs on the people in the sending country than they do on the actors from the receiving the target company. That's where you just summarize that. And there's my references. All right, so go ahead, Josh.
Okay. And I've had a couple of thoughts on this after reading the material. And I was going to give a couple of my opinions and then open it up for discussion on something similarly related, at least in name. First of all, sanctions are a political convenience to the ruling class. If, say, Trump doesn't like what somebody's doing, he's going to go in and post a sanctions regime. Or if Biden or, you know, little Bush or Obama, they'll do it to try to maintain an image of being tough on whatever thing they're trying to face. Like, we don't like that Venezuela has, you know, had decided to start to nationalizing their oil supply. So what we're going to do is we're going to issue a sanctions regime and try to, you know, destabilize that government. As I said, I'm not a Maduro stan. I did like Chavez much better than Maduro, but basically it just put economic hardship on the people, and in such a way that you know, didn't really achieve the policy goals. Because the Chavez government, if it was really I mean, they took power, there was a coup, and then within a week there was a popular uprising, and he was put in power. Maduro wasn't able to do that as well, but the resulting had to do with the economic crisis that is still going on today in Venezuela. The other example is and it's used, and it has been used in the United States as part of Cold War policy to embargo Cuba. Cuba, and it causes economic hardships on the people of Cuba. And it's being said that they want to get in and bring freedom and market and all that to Cuba, but effectively it hasn't worked in 70 years. The only thing that it's done has been to put hurt on the people of Cuba. If Cuba wanted a revolution, it would have happened, and it would have probably been funded and supported by the United States. But we are using this. I'm not sure why we still have this embargo up, but it's not shown to be at all effective vis-a-vis U.S. policy goals, and it's just put it's just put hardship on the Cuban people. Bill, go ahead.
Oh well, this is a much longer discussion. I'll try to make it shorter than the Benny bearded snake story. Uh, hopefully, there's this idea, and this is, you know, the main theory that the main theory that I utilized when I was working on my dissertation, that our foreign policy decision makers are like gamblers in a casino at this point. They're like, it's like if you go into play roulette and you have $100, you put $100 on the roulette wheel or whatever the case may be, and you bet $5 or $2, whatever the minimum bet is, and you go down significantly from your $100. You become way more risk acceptant, like you're trying to get back up to that $100. And if you are up, if you actually start winning and you're over $100, you become way more risk averse, where you're unwilling to like lose money to get back down to the 100. And so in 1959, we have what's called the status quo setting position, where the United States is still basically treating Cuba as a virtual colony. We're saying what's up in Cuba. We have control over most of the economy and that kind of stuff, and various most of the governmental institutions. That's our status quo. That's our $100 in this casino. Ever since then, we've been in a losing mode where we're down from that status quo position, or that $100 in the gambler analogy. And so we're constantly trying to do more stuff and more stuff to get back to where we were in 1959 when the Cuban Revolution happened. And we're never going to get there, but it makes you accept risk when you shouldn't. You should just pick up your money and leave and not play anymore. It makes you accept that risk because the whole goal is for the casino to take all your money. And so in this case, there's no way to win in that situation, or in the U.S. Cuban policy, where we continually keep sanctions on that country and a trade embargo against that country. We can't possibly ever get back to where we were in 1959. That's never going to happen. So our policymakers have one of two options. The third option of getting back there is not an option. We can either pick up our money and leave. In other words, start treating Cuba the way we started treating China in the 70s, as an equal, as another state just like us, who we work with, the same way we would work with England or something like that. Or we can continue to do the same thing ad infinitum until we, just die as a country, I guess. And it's not going to change anything. We just stick on the same. The third option of ever getting back to 1959 is not there anymore. But it's called the gambler theory, or the risk-based theory of foreign policy. Over.
Yeah. Very good. I think the widespread use of economic sanctions in the United States, and the secondary sanctions imposed on other countries and companies for trading with who trade with people that we've sanctioned, cause a lot of hurt all around. But I think one of the major effects of this is the fact that it's pushing a whole lot more people into the BRIC standard and taking and going off the US dollar as their reserve currency. And when it comes down to it, the United States, as awful as hegemony as it is, the last remaining imperial power in the world at this point, is that one of the reasons why the United States is perceived and is probably as powerful as it is as an empire is that a good chunk of the world uses the dollar as a reserve currency. If we push everybody into BRICS, whether it's by our just excessive use of sanctions regimes, and arming Israel to bomb Palestine and stuff like that, the US runs the risk of losing its status as the world's reserve currency, at which point the dollar becomes less valuable and easier to fail. So that is a big danger of sanctions regimes. The second danger has to do with when the government puts a sanction regime, at least what they're telling, the end goal of that a lot of times is regime change, which hasn't really been shown to do that in the theory. But in the theory that if you're going to put so much pain on the populace of a country to where they're going to overthrow the government, leaves out the fact that a starving populace makes a much less effective revolutionary force. And it doesn't get the United States what it wants, U.S. imperialist, capitalist power in place, like a puppet regime in place that is beholden to the United States that are capitalist. Because when people get hungry and people revolt, they tend to, if they're organizing around food insecurity and stuff, tend not to always form right-wing governments that the United States would like to see. But there was one other thing, and just the civilian death toll is is just they say it's war by other means, or economic war. They're putting it as a middle ground, but there are real graves. There are real like famines and that have certainly have a death toll. And so it's not a moral regime. And and it is my opinion that at least large scale sanctions should not be used as a tool of foreign policy. There is no moral high ground to do it. It's like drone strikes. Like you kill a lot of people you don't intend to kill, but when you make that calculus, you're devaluing the life of the common people in whatever place you're doing. If you want to liberate, Venezuela from the Maduro government, starving the fuck out of their people isn't really the path forward, because you're hurting the people that you're abstentiously trying to help. So those are just my thoughts. And the thing that I wanted to discuss with everybody, and if you want to talk about it, I can let you in as a panelist, or you can type in the stack, has to do with a discussion that came up at a meeting that I wasn't there, at the anti-war working group, that the BDS movement, whether against South Africa or against Israel, because of the treatment of the Palestinian states, what is the difference between? It has BDS's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Is it considered a sanctions regime? And what is the difference between the BDS movement and sanctions placed by one state on another? And I was going to throw that out there and see what I can give you my opinion, but and we might not all agree on it, but what does anybody have a thought on, why are sanctions by state actors bad and BDS not a valid form of of protest to stop it, and what's the difference thereof?
A little bit of context on this, and this came up during that anti-war thing. Is it, if we say we support the BDS, does that? I guess the question that it gets to, more than anything specific that happened during that meeting, is, do we have, if we support BDS, which literally aims to target companies that do business with these regimes that are acting like monsters in their policies. For example, the government of Israel, who are engaged in genocide in Gaza, and doing illegal settlement and whatnot, and killing people in the West Bank. Our goal is to decrease the ability of that government to acquire the means that it needs to get weapons and get money internationally, by targeting the businesses that legitimize the things that the government is doing. So that in and of itself is, maybe someone might have a better way to put that. Well, that's how I understand it. But do we incur a moral obligation to the people who, say, if you take a look at some company, let's just take, Joe's Widget Shop or whatever, it's some fake company. I'm sure we have a whole list of people on the BDS one, but I don't have that pulled up in front of me now. Let's say Joe Widgets. Joe Widgets, employs 600 people in Israel, whatever. And they're very strong supporters of the Israeli government, and they send a lot of money to the Israeli government, and they also, fund candidates and everything like that. They're really just in support of this whole thing. So they become targeted by the BDS movement, and they go out of business as a result of it, because people listen to the BDS stuff, and they divest in Joe's Widgets, and they boycott Joe's Widgets in the market, and that kind of stuff. Do we have a moral obligation to those 600 workers at Joe's Widgets when that company goes out of business and they lose their livelihood? And I think that that's probably the crux of the thing that Josh is getting at. I mean, supporting it from a people's perspective seems to be like a good thing, because it's the people that are doing it, not the liberal government that's doing it. But is there any kind of moral obligation that we have to the people that are impacted who are working for those companies because we shut down their employer? I guess that's my addition to your question.
Okay. And
Looks like
Felicity says we've spoken today
Amy's.
about the drawbacks of U.S. approach to sanction and encourages private industry to find loopholes and may lack broad support. It is ultimately backed by military force. I'd answer the main difference between that and BDS is BDS is generally democratic and a global movement. And second, it is clearly effective. The answer to a moral obligation. And then Amy, you're on stack. Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't see that very well.
I'm reading essay 4 in Socialist Introduction to Palestine, and it addresses the sanctions. And I was really interested to see that they're saying, well, the BDS is okay because the working class of the Israel are not on the side of the working class, really, because they're okay with oppressing Palestinians and murdering them in genocide. So, like, well, that's an interesting take. Out.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in my personal opinion, is that and then I'll give it to you, Bill. Is that there is a difference between a state implying that if Joe's Widgets is only supplying Israel and are domestically, that could cause a problem. But generally, most of the businesses that are targeted are businesses that could or that could sell their stuff anyway. It's not like we're, you know, BDS, most of the BDS targets are international corporations, either tech or to some degree McDonald's, some of the corporate food service. But whereas if the United States puts economic sanctions on a country, it's going to cause the country to fail because it impacts the entire, you know, it's targeted on an entire company, and it has blowbacks to the United States, whereas BDS is something proposed by people that are being oppressed to do that, and it's not pressuring states to do it because states aren't. But it's you know, it's sanctions, but I don't think it's the same as a sanctions regime. And it's important that that people powered movements in order to stop oppression are done. Like there was a BDS regime against South Africa, and while it didn't shut down, you know, South Africa, and it's not going to shut down the government of Israel, it's gonna put pressure on companies that are funding that not to do that stuff. And I think as a general rule, most of the companies on the BDS list are not going to go under because they don't just trade with Israel. So I as somebody who has participated in BDS as far as I've been able to for the last 10 years, I would say that I don't think we have moral obligation. I mean, we have the moral obligation to educate the workers and you know, about why this pressure is being put against that. But I think that's part of the BDS movement as well. And Bill, you're on stack, and then Felicity had written a comment as well. Go ahead, Bill.
So again, this is devil's advocate for me. I generally am supportive of any measures we can take to get foreign governments to stop doing horrendous policies. I tend to be more of a realist with regard to this. You know, it does come down to some form of war. If we want some other country to do something, the only tools we have in our work hard, I don't believe that, you know, we can like morally shame the Israeli government. I don't think that's possible. It's just like I don't think that it's possible to morally shame the capitalists in this country to do better. They're amoral actors. They don't really. That's not a consideration of theirs. The only way we can do it is to make them stop. But that being said, you know, I wonder about the BDS thing just because it sounds like, you know, and I don't want to steal Felicity's thunder on this. And just to respond, I guess, then to Amy, you know, while we might not have like obligation to those workers that are in those kind of industries and stuff like that, like, isn't there the whole idea that socialists talk about working class solidarity, and the working class exists outside of the national structure? And does that open the door then? Just this is this purely rhetorical question, or maybe it's a question for discussion if you want, but does that open the door then to us saying, well, you know, fascist workers in America or right-wing workers in America, we don't have any obligation to them. Who cares what happened to them if they, you know, if they lose their job, if they get bombed out of existence, whatever, you know, they shouldn't have backed the right wing. Do we have any obligation to that, or are they just fair game because we don't happen to like their politics? Again, I don't really have the answer to that question. It's just something that's on my mind. Over.
Okay, and I'll read Felicity's statement. My answer to the question is a moral obligation. Is now we don't owe workers in fascist industries restraint over their victims. A settler colonial economy built by and on settlers who are culpable to the actions of their colonial government. You know, I tend to agree with that, because I think that the purpose of boycotts and stuff from civil society as opposed to a state actor is an understanding that there is no moral appeal, because companies are by nature and technically by fiduciary responsibility immoral actors, right? They're going, so if you're going to put a hurt against
excuse me, Josh, real quick, there's a difference between amoral and immoral. I think amoral is the word.
Yeah,
amoral means they have no moral is one way or another. Immoral is bad.
yeah. Well, and I think I think the capitalist system is immoral as well as amoral, but
Agreed.
But what I'm saying is that the only way that you can convince large corporations to change their behavior is to cut into their profits, right? It's the only way that's going to happen, because otherwise their only goal in their corporate charter is to acquire wealth. So yeah. I mean, workers don't control the government, so, but we're not boycotting nations. BDS isn't boycotting nations; it's boycotting companies that contribute to the apartheid of and the genocide in Israel in this case, but into the apartheid in South Africa as well. And it's to get them to make a change about, you know, where they spend their money, because you can't talk to them logically about it. You can't go in morally and arguing that genocide is bad, so you need to not do that, because they have a fiduciary responsibility not to care about any of that. It's just making money. That's why Exxon walked away from the Valdez cleanup, because it was more expensive to fix, to let the government do it and pay the fine, than it was to actually do anything to clean it up. So when it comes down to it, the responsibility to the workers, we can, if need be, help them find other jobs. And I think an effective way to solve that problem is to encourage unionization across the board. And you know, and a good majority of the unions tend to stand on the right side. Not all of them, but especially the business unions are a little tepid on that. But it's about educating the workers there too. Because if you have a job where you knowingly make bombs that are going to drop on children, and you're okay with that, that's a problem too, right? Like, you know, surely you can find other work. but you know, that could just be me. But you know, I tend to I tend to fall on the side that sanctuary regimes by states don't do anything in the long run to make a world a better place, and B, have a good effect on the sending country as well. Whereas social movements that use boycott certain industries and certain corporations that are contributing to bad things, you know, it's not like the states go, it's not like we're saying we're not going to do business with any company in Italy because they sell Coca-Cola. What we're doing is trying to get Coca-Cola from contributing to money to a regime that, you know, that is bombing children. And you know, so personally, I am in favor of the BDS movement as is written now, and I oppose widespread economic sanctions just because I there's really no positives in it except for short-term political convenience. So whatever oligarch is in charge of the United States or other wealthy states can say that they're tough on whatever. But go ahead, Bill.
Also, it's important to remember that, you know, the Josh, can you actually just say what you just said again? Because I was thinking about something like that, but I need a second more to think about what I'm going to say about about the oligarchs.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that large scale economic sanctions are good for are the short term
Oh
goal
yeah, yeah.
of the whoever the oligarch is in charge of the United States or other rich nations, because it doesn't really affect anything. It just gives them the ability to say, we don't like X company or X country, so I put economic sanctions on it, which is effectively not doing anything except causing suffering all around, but it
Right.
makes them look like they're tough on communism or tough on dictators, which is hilarious coming from the United States because we tend to prop those up rather than bring those down.
Yeah, that's the thing I wanted to say was kind of going off that was that oligarchs themselves are by definition like insulated from sanctions regimes. This is one of the reasons why the sanctions regimes don't work is because we can put all the sanctions we want on Putin's inner circle and it doesn't affect them. Like they have so much money that if you took half of their money, they'd still be extremely rich. You know, like if you took, if you have someone with like $100 billion, if you take half of that, they still got $50 billion. And so, like, the idea that we could actually affect these guys to the point where they're screaming and they're like, "Oh my God, Vladimir, you got to stop this invasion in Ukraine because we lost $25 billion due to these sanctions last year. I don't even know if we can continue to." No, they have like another $900 billion or whatever stacked in a yacht somewhere in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea that they're just like living off of. It's not a big deal to these people. So it really only does hurt the workers and the poor of the target countries, and also it hurts the workers and the poor in this country too, who now have to pay higher prices for food and fuel because we have these ridiculous sanctions on Russia, which don't actually affect the people they're even targeting. They don't change behavior in Russia. They make it less likely that Russia is ever going to come to any kind of peaceful terms. There's like no pressure at all that we can put on it. It's like a complete all around negative experience for everybody except for the politicians who want to look like they're doing something and the oligarchs who are completely insulated and protected from all this anyway. So I always have my wonder about, and while I support BDS in principle and everything, I also wonder how effective that's going to actually be, because as you mentioned, Josh, they have a fiduciary responsibility to turn a profit for their shareholders, and I wonder like how much effect that has on those companies when there are so many people who still will buy those products even if there's 10 million of us that did BDS, and they still got another 200,000 or 200 million clients that will buy the products without regard to the BDS. So that's always a wonder of mine too. But in principle, I support them because I do believe we need to be putting pressure on these companies to stop supporting governments that do genocide. And I really like how you put that. That answered a lot of my hesitations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's just when it comes down to economic sanctions, again, don't by countries don't generally work. I mean, we haven't crushed China. We've actually helped China. Again, I don't see China isn't as communist as it says it is, but they did lift, even though World Health Organization says that they lifted like 800 billion people out of poverty, and that's a low number coming from stuff like that. But it's like I said before, it's just political theater for whichever capitalist oligarch is in charge of the United States or other nations that do that. And when it comes down to it, it's used so frequently and so harshly that I think that eventually what it's going to do, it's gonna push people away from using the dollar as a reserve currency, because if the US can just come after you and then you're screwed, why use that?
And when people stop using the dollar as their reserve currency, then we're really screwed, because then our debt
Right.
comes due.
Uh,
We got to start paying. We could do that with fiat currency. We just like print a $20 trillion note and deposit it in a bank somewhere, but we don't have to print the note. We can just like hit a couple extra zeros on the keyboard. But once people stop accepting it in US currency, then we got to use that money to buy whatever foreign currency they're accepting and pay the debt back. And it's gonna be a real burden for this country.
Yeah. And the other thing is again, I would like to state that BDS isn't just trying to put some financial hardships on countries to change, or on companies to change their position on where they spend their money. Whether or not it works large scale is one thing, but one thing that it does is it raises awareness of what's going on. If people are like boycotting Dr. Pepper because they spend a whole shit ton of money in Israel, it will cause people to ask why that is. I mean, I'm a big fan of Dr. Pepper. I haven't drank it in a long time, but what it does is it sends a message, and it sends a message within context. Whereas, because if people are on BDS, if I'm out with my friends and they want Dr. Pepper and I say no, I'm not going to do that, it's because BDS, because they give significant amounts of money to and work with the Israeli government. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to support that because of the genocide and the 80 years of genocide and apartheid that have gone on in that society. So whether or not it's the be all end all that's going to change the behavior, maybe it's not, maybe it is, but it's a combination of political pressure and the ability to get the word out on why, and hopefully bring attention to the conditions that caused it, because without context, it's probably not going to affect anything. But since there is good context, it's a good way to get the message out. So that's why I am and have been a supporter of BDS, for what it's worth. But I'm not really anybody important. So does anybody have any questions, any comments they want to throw in? I can bring you in, you can talk, or we can go. But another thing, it is a very neoliberal thing to do with sanction regimes, and it is warfare. In my opinion, it's warfare by another method, because there are significant deaths in target countries. and it generally hurts people in the sending country as well. So, you know, it might not be as explodey and bloody, but I mean, you know, million
The
people dying due to not getting food is also death.
right. The important thing to remember with all liberal foreign policy options, including treaties and international organizations and like the UN and everything, is the liberals like to say that it's the answer or the way to mitigate the fact that there is just war in the internet. Like that's all we really have. We like to pretend, or liberal Democrats like to pretend that the UN is the answer to war, like it's the end of war. But the only power the UN has is when it's backed up by force. When it's working with some country or a bunch of several countries to threaten to go to war if you don't do what we tell you to do. And more wars have been under the aegis of the UN, UN sanctions recently, especially than haven't been. So it's really important to remember that the liberals don't ever resolve war, and sanctions regime is a very liberal concept. It's a very liberal what they think is an answer to war. But as you mentioned, Josh, it's just another form of war. The design is to punish with the use of force or the threat of the use of force. And so you either do what we want you to do, or we're going to invade. Has been replaced by you do what we want you to do, or we're going to make your economy scream, and then you're going to be overthrown, and then you're going to probably be executed by your own people that we happen to be arming and training. So it goes to war eventually. We're not really ever free of war. Shouldn't be that way. I don't like the fact that it is that way, but the fact is that the realists there's a reason why they're called the realists, is because in a lot of ways that they're just describing reality. There's war and there's conflict, and if we want some other sovereign nation to do something, we have to threaten them, either implicitly or explicitly, to get them to do what we want them to do, that they're not otherwise inclined to do it, because we don't have any ability to go into Russia and change their laws and change their policies. Even with BDS, or some kind of sanctions regime or whatever, we can't stop Israel from doing what they're going to do.
Stop
But
giving weapons to do it.
we can, but if we stop giving them weapons, I'm sure there's other countries that are lined up to supply Israel with 500-pound bombs. There's no shortage of 500-pound bombs. In a lot of cases, those 500-pound bombs came from us, and the other country's just going to be the middleman then. So that's, I guess, yeah, that's liberalism in a nutshell. They think that they're mitigating war, and as a matter of fact, they're just postponing it.
Yeah, and another
or
thing,
masking it.
yeah, and the other thing to think about in regards to sanctions, wars, destabilizations, propping up dictators, everything the U.S. Government doesn't do it to make A, the world a better place, or B, to make it better for the American people. They do it to ensure that the bourgeois, like owning class, can still make their money, right? Like Nicaragua, we fought a revolution to try to prevent the Sandinistas back in the 70s to not resist United Fruit and the totalitarian of that. I mean, a lot of our, we're still embargoing Cuba because they overthrew our puppet dictator and the organized crime people that were running it as a colonial power. We're not doing this because it benefits the people in Cuba. We're not doing it because it benefits the people of the United States. We're doing it to benefit a very few people, corporations and the wealthy. And so under the guise of, and it's a very under globalization, it's a very neoliberal thing to do. We didn't get involved in Iraq for any reason other than we wanted access to the oil. We are not giving a shit ton of weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is a pretty far right country, for any other reasons is to guarantee oil supply. We're not supporting Israel for any other reason to have a puppet state in the middle of a large amount of oil production. neoliberalism tries to point out human rights abuses and this, that, and the other under the regimes, but at the same time, it does everything it can to put up and support dictators that are very terrible on human rights in order to make sure that we have favorable trade deals for our corporations. We just tried another coup against Bolivia, right? Like we sponsored a successful coup in Bolivia several years back, and then that coup was eventually defeated, and they tried it again. That didn't succeed, but we're not doing it to make the world a better place. We're doing it to secure lithium reserves for Elon Musk.
Yep.
The calculus of a neoliberal foreign policy has to do with the enriching of corporate interests and not necessarily even domestic corporate interests, because international corporations have their stuff there. So if you want to see why the world is happening and what's really happening in the world, it just has to do with the domination of the economic interest by the people that donate to campaigns.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right. We don't even do a very good job hiding it. I mean, any protestation we talk about with human rights or whatever is really just for the newspapers. The saying comes to mind that Madeleine Albright said, and I think that she must have been paraphrasing someone, maybe Kissinger, was that the United States does not have friends, we only have interests. And our interests tend to align with capital very, very closely. So, all right, I think we're about done. So for those two of you who stuck with us, Amy and Ren, we appreciate it. And for everyone else who is listening to this at home or will be listening to it here in the future, thank you for listening, and we hope it was informative.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
so,